So this is part 2 of my commentary on the June 26, 2019 Democratic presidential primary debate that took place on MSNBC. Make sure I got my dates right. Yeah, June 26, last night on MSNBC. I was just going through the candidates that I did not connect with at the debate, and I was talking about Mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, and I was bemoaning the fact that it seemed to me that he was going after the rich in a way that he was scapegoating them and sort of irrational in an overly emotional and overly generic in his discussion, the way he thought about the rich. And I am not certain that taxing the rich at the individual rate of 70% is necessarily a good idea. I don't feel that people should, I don't think we should be taking most of anyone's money. That is something I vehemently oppose. I don't even think we should be taking as much as half of someone's money. I don't think I could ever stand behind more of a income tax rate of probably no more than 44%. I do owe you transparency with how I would come at that number and what the proper rate is, but I will tell you I do not believe you should take half of someone's wealth. I don't believe you should take nearly half of someone's wealth. So I put that we've had it at about 39%, somewhere between like 38 and 44% for the top income level, I think is probably reasonable, but 70% is excessive. And that just has a real anti-wealth philosophy. It's true, you could probably be really rich and be taxed at that rate and still be very rich. I'm not an expert on tax policy and how the different percentages work with respect to the revenue they generate and how that influences the budget. But I would say, like, on a philosophical, ethical level, I don't believe anyone is entitled to touch a substantial portion of someone's money. And I say that, again, as someone who, if you were just watching the previous video, I say that as someone who considers himself pretty staunchly liberal, someone who I feel, for example, very strongly about having a widely accessible, affordable housing service, because I don't believe anyone should live without dignified shelter and a comfortable home. I'm not saying a luxurious home, but I like the way Elizabeth Warren, she had a good quote, and I'll get to that very briefly. Bottom line, though, I wasn't enthralled with Mayor Bill de Blasio. So those are the candidates that I did not connect so much with. And just like now, I want to get to candidates that impressed me, that I connected with on a pretty deep level, and why I did. So there were 3 candidates who sort of each impressed me on various fronts for different reasons. I couldn't say I necessarily had a favorite, though I do lean towards Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who is looking more and more like the front runner. It did seem like one criticism that might be had of the debate was that it did seem like, I didn't count, but it seemed like she got asked more questions and that she got treated as the front runner. I think the question started and ended with her, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, she was asked the first question and she was asked the last question. So I thought that though there was an attempt perhaps to not treat certain people like the winner or the loser group among the larger group, it was my perception that ultimately Elizabeth Warren, wow, I'm sorry I called you Liz, Senator Warren. I did think that while it is true that she probably resonated with me more than any other candidate, it did seem to me that she got preferential treatment, and I don't think that's fair or right. Anyway, the 3 people that impressed me most, I'm actually going to save Elizabeth Warren for last here. Well, no, I'm not. I thought I was going to, but I'm going to start with her. The top thing that impressed me with Elizabeth Warren above everything else, I believe that she is a genius communicator. It's obvious that academia served her ability to express herself quite well, because she put things in such a way where I never felt that she was overly ambiguous. I never got the impression that she wasn't, I think with one exception, actually answering the question asked of her. And people like Beto O'Rourke didn't always directly answer the question they were asked. I don't like when they do that. So she really expressed herself really well, and one of her strongest moments, I don't have the quote verbatim, so I'm just going to give you the essence of what she said. But she said something to the extent of how she was offered a little slice of government which created an opportunity for a girl, and she wants to provide that for everyone. So, so she was talking about how, she didn't even have enough money, her family didn't even have enough money for her to apply for college. So she was lucky enough to get some financial assistance to get her feet into her higher education, and that took her a long way. So the bottom line in her, I think, expressing sort of overall her philosophical view is that it's not about like overbearing people with government provisions like an excessive welfare state or something like that. And she's obviously not a socialist per se, like Bernie Sanders is. However, I think her point is not everybody is going to be in a state where psychologically they can always navigate themselves through the capitalist economy the way that it is and find themselves with easy access to a necessary amount of money. And if the government can, through various mechanisms, provide assistance for people, then they themselves can become huge successes with that little investment, right? She's talking about government investment in people, not governments thoroughly and fully funding every aspect of people's lives. Like, again, some excessive welfare state concept, but this idea that the government invests in people, especially people who are in rough spots, who can use that bit of investment. Just like if you're a startup company, right? And someone can help you get your feet on the ground and stand up and launch as a business. And so you got that little bit of help. You did get help, but you weren't dependent on it all throughout your life. It helped you establish your own independence. And so I think Elizabeth Warren is really onto something. Again, understanding the philosophical part of where she comes from as much as understanding how it applies more concretely. So she really impressed me with that quite a lot. That was the number one thing Elizabeth Warren did that impressed me. I'm trying to see if there was anything else that struck me as exceptional. Yeah, there was another example of just great communication, keeping in mind that I do believe that one of the most important functions of a president is to have someone who can communicate exceptionally. I think that was one thing that I loved about President Barack Obama. Even during my Republican and Libertarian phases, I was always rather smitten by Obama's impeccable eloquence. So much so that, in fact, back in 2008, when I voted for Obama the first time, President Obama, despite my enthusiasm for him, particularly on account of his eloquence, he was so eloquent that it actually gave me a slight discomfort. And I thought anyone who speaks that well must have some sort of hidden fascist motives. In hindsight, I don't think that about President Obama, but I would like to say that indeed, he was well-spoken, and I think he provides an example of how having a president who can speak is part of, I think, lead it, being the leader of the party, being a leader of an executive branch, being a leader in general. I think effective communication is important. How else are you going to see to it that the laws are faithfully executed in a way where everyone who is under your management and supervision can understand you and understand the importance of how you are rallying us all? So I think Elizabeth Warren was really good at that. So another thing she talked about, she really put this well, when she was talking about the importance of government investment in green technology. She said this. She said there is a need for it. And I thought that mere utterance of the fact that there is a need for it, I think spoke to the fact that in terms of visualizing how our economy moves forward, a huge part of understanding how to advance an economy is, right, just from a pure business mentality. Is there a need for what I want to provide? Are there gaps in our marketplace? Are there clear needs? Or, I mean, that's a wide and loaded discussion. What are things we would like to see in our economy? Because there are more super pragmatic elements to that. I think like green energy being one example of that. And there are other, like art, I believe, is a need. However, might not, luxury is a need as well. However, I think that these aspects of the marketplace might be more difficult to... I'm not 100% where I wanted to go with that thought. Damn, I hate when that happens. Look, the economy and what we need that's a loaded discussion. But my bottom line is the mere consciousness and mental experience of saying this is something that would suit our economy, suit our market, specifically in terms of cultural issues that we face, such as climate change and environmental issues. I think Senator Warren understands that an investment in green energy would go a long way on various fronts: economic, environmental, etc. I know that Governor of Washington, Delaney, was it? No, Inslee, I'm sorry. Jay Inslee, I know that that's his pet topic. It is an important topic, but I think Elizabeth Warren spoke to it well without subordinating, without leaving out other topics that she needed to talk about. So she really impressed me quite a lot. The other candidate who impressed me quite a lot was Amy Klobuchar. Amy Klobuchar was interesting because I'd seen how she conducted herself during the Kavanaugh hearings back in the late summer, early fall. Strange time in my life. Don't want to delve too much into that. I would just say that Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, is actually someone I don't know so much about. I've seen her on a few interviews, and again, I watched her during the hearings and watched how she conducted herself, but she's not someone that I've vetted as thoroughly or read about as thoroughly as other candidates. So it was nice to see how she conducted herself in contrast to her fellow Democrats. And I have to tell you, she really impressed me on a lot of fronts. What impressed me most of all about Klobuchar is that she didn't strike me as like too emotional in the way that she expressed herself. If there's one thing that at times... So one thing about Elizabeth Warren is she is extremely passionate. Sometimes her extreme passion can come across to me as almost a tinge of too much emotion. I'm not saying that's necessarily how she is, but at times I need to substantiate that, and maybe that's an awful thing for me to say, but there are times she can come across to me as overly emotional or so passionate that the feeling of her passion, as I'm perceiving her and processing what she says, can almost take me away from what she says in itself. It's a hard thing for me to articulate. So I've got to spend more time thinking about that. Obviously, this is the first debate, so really seeing how these different people stand out and distinguish themselves in all of these aspects is something, in the next several months that we'll have more conversation about. But in contrast to Elizabeth Warren, I really, Senator Amy Klobuchar really came across to me as someone who was remarkably poised, and though she was passionate, I didn't feel that her sense of passion took me away from the policies she was passionate about. Moreover, for example, in the way she talked about healthcare and her view that it is important that everyone receive health insurance, it was important to her to emphasize that it's important to have a public option for health insurance as opposed to abolishing private health insurance. This was something I need to learn more about Elizabeth Warren's views on with respect to health insurance, because for me, it wasn't 100% clear what she believes exactly, if she believes there is any role whatsoever for private health insurance. But there were a few people who seemed to be saying that health insurance as a entrepreneurial enterprise is such that a desire for profit will always corrupt any kinds of decisions that a business would make and always put people's medical interests to the side. And so I thought, though, so I'm not 100% sure exactly where Elizabeth Warren would stand on how we would transition out of private insurance in I think, an orderly way. But I did just get the impression that Senator Klobuchar had her eyes on making sure everyone had access to good health care without snapping your fingers and saying no more private health insurance. To me, that just came across as more rational. She also had a really rational approach to immigration. I mentioned earlier there was this tension between Julian Castro and other candidates with respect to how to approach people who cross the border. And Amy Klobuchar was one who said that it is important that we are very humane with people who cross the border, and that we, of course, do away with the way Trump is handling that. But she said it is important to keep in mind that we need to have laws in place that equip the executive branch and the federal government in addressing criminals and people who are crossing the border who are dangerous. I wish I could find the exact quote that she had said, but it did strike me that she wanted to be clear that we were just rational with respect to how we address the border, and being both mindful of being humanists and humanitarian type people with respect to who crosses the border and the fact that people are crossing the border to seek political asylum or safety, things of that nature, but not having this rhetorical disregard for the fact that you still need to have secure borders. Just rationally speaking, not having a discussion about the fact that there is such a thing as it being illegal to simply cross the border without any respect for any kind of, what's the right way to put it? We do have laws on the books for how we go about our immigration process and what it means to enter another country. And there's got to be some sense of security. I'm not saying I agree with the Republican approach or Trump's approach, and I'm not saying I believe that we should go on a mad deportation spree. I do believe, however, we want to have the proper legal infrastructure in place to acknowledge the fact that there are people who may cross the border, who are criminals, who are part of a gang, dangerous, drug cartel type gang, or who are part of some sex trafficking organization. We just want to be mindful of having security on our borders. And I believe she spoke to that in a way that was just clearer than was the case with Julian Castro. So yeah, Amy Klobuchar impressed me with just being exquisitely rational. Finally, I wanted to talk to you about Tim Ryan, Representative Tim Ryan of Ohio. Interesting guy. Shout out to my coworker, the brilliant philosopher Matthew Snope, who, when I had asked him his opinion on the primary elections and Democratic candidates, he was the one who said, why don't you take a look at Tim Ryan? And I do have to say, I am more impressed with Tim Ryan than I thought I was going to be. I hadn't really paid any attention to him. I had really only heard his name and not really heard anything he had to say. I was so impressed with Tim Ryan that, in my opinion, out of all of the candidates that spoke at the last debate, he would be my top choice for vice president. And I say this because I believe that a woman should be president this time around, and a woman should be the Democratic nominee for president. You can check out, I do have a vlog on that topic. I explain that further. What did I like about Representative Tim Ryan? First of all, he was extraordinarily passionate. At times, he did seem uncomfortably angry. It would be one criticism I have. However, it was the case that he always accompanied it with clear policies. He was very particular in policies that he advocated, and he was one of the most policy-rich candidates of the evening, almost more so than Elizabeth Warren, actually. He talked about, for example, in addressing the shootings, that the epidemic of mass shootings in our country, he was the one who said, it's really important that we have something in place in our schools so that we have, I think his terminology was social and emotional well-being counseling and awareness and education in schools, because it's clear that we have people who are motivated to go buy weapons and shoot someone and they're not in a healthy frame of mind, whether it's a result of bullying or there's some sort of psychological issue. So we clearly need to be more mindful of what's going on psychologically in our youth, and having something in place in our schools may be the way to do it. I'm not 100% sure from a psychological level how we want to have a conversation about that, but I think that Representative Ryan clearly was aware that that is a conversation we need to have, and he, to me, was the most emphatic and conscious of that. Also, Representative Ryan, Tim Ryan, seemed to me one of the most aware in the importance of being inclusive-minded or inclusion-minded and universal, as opposed to playing identity politics. And you might think I'm a hypocrite because I believe that we should have a female candidate for president, but I'm not doing that because I believe in pandering to women. I believe that our policies are such that there is still significant inequality between men and women, such that there is not even equal female representation in our realms of leadership. And I do believe that putting a woman in charge of the executive branch and as our commander-in-chief, I believe would go a long way in advancing women's place in our realms of leadership. Point being, though, that in general, that doesn't mean that I believe that anybody should feel left out from policies and who they benefit. That's not to say that I don't recognize that different groups have different plights, right? For example, there was mention of how African American community and Latinx community suffer significantly in our country compared to other minority demographics. And I do think it's important to be emphatic about that, but I would want to make sure that other demographics didn't feel left out. Specifically, for example, one thing that concerns me is that there's actually not enough conversation about the plight of Native Americans. And that's because they're a super minority in this country. And as such, they don't get much discussion in the media or in our broader policy discussion socially. And so, or you could talk about Muslim Americans as well, or Jewish Americans. I think that there are various minority demographics and subgroups, people who are our senior citizens, different groups. I think, as opposed to just spending time only talking about one, I really liked that Representative Tim Ryan of Ohio, was so emphatic about making sure that we appreciate all workers, all people. He really was passionate about inclusiveness in his way of thinking. Also, when it comes to Afghanistan, he was right on the money about the fact that while we do want to have a conversation about withdrawing from Afghanistan as a goal, we need to be really engaged in how we're dealing with Afghanistan. We're not even sufficiently engaged to really begin the withdrawal process. He got into quite a spat with Tulsi Gabbard, representative of Hawaii, about that, and he was on the upper hand on that, and I just think he was right on the money with it. So to me, it just seems like Tim Ryan, not only did he seem to have a sort of policy-rich mentality and to be sort of universal, have an interest in all Americans, he also seems to be with it on foreign policy, and just seemed to me someone with respect to being holistically aware of our political scene. He seemed to be most with it to me. He was really on the money and very impressive to me. So those are the three candidates that I liked the most. Representative Tim Ryan of Ohio, Senators Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Now, the two candidates that I just don't know what I think about yet would be former Representative Beto O'Rourke and Senator of Texas, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, my state here, yay, New Jersey. I tell you, I love New Jersey, and it's interesting because I hated it for most of my life. Another long conversation to have. What stood out to me about Booker, I liked his approach to guns and how we need to treat guns like we treat cars, making sure that people are properly vetted and licensed to carry and own. As to Beto, I think what struck me about Beto O'Rourke, what I liked was his view on health insurance and knowing the importance of making sure that everyone had access to healthcare without trying to just snap our fingers and obliterate the existence of private healthcare insurance. That being said, Beto O'Rourke neither did Cory Booker, neither of them were really good, in my opinion, at always answering questions that they were asked. And that's always, to me, quite annoying. And also, I guess this is a question I would want to raise for you guys. I'm not 100% sure where I stand on it. I did note that Beto O'Rourke, the first thing he did was speak in Spanish. And it's not that I really have a problem with candidates speaking another language or the existence of other languages in this country. Speak what you want. I'm very socially libertarian. However, to me, it almost came across more like he was trying to be impressive and appeal to a group than just talk about the policies. So I get that he's really sensitive, and I get that there's a tremendous importance in being sensitive as to how Latin Americans are treated in the United States, how there's an immigration crisis, and how people on the border are not being treated properly, and how President Trump is disgusting in his treatment of Latin Americans and Central Americans and Mexicans and Latinos and such. And so I understand also that Spanish, I believe, is the second most widely used language in this country. So I can understand the rationale for wanting to speak in Spanish. But I think if you really believed that it was so important to have so much discussion in Spanish, that there would just be a lot more that you say in Spanish. To me, it seemed like gimmicky and a cheap, quick, hey, look at you, Latin Americans, I want you to know I'm thinking of you. Again, what about the Native Americans? What about the Arabic and Muslim Americans? What about the Jewish Americans? What about all these other minority groups, that the Asian Americans, that aren't getting represented when you don't speak their language? I just think while it is really important to be aware of plights that various minority groups experience, it's also really important to be really inclusive and to make sure that nobody feels left out, in my opinion. So, and also not to single out groups as a means of pandering particularly, or as a means of sort of artificially trying to appeal to someone to score points on a superficial emotional level without following it through with something really substantive and mindful of the more holistic picture of where this country is. So that's where I stand with the candidates. That's my analysis of the candidates with respect to the debate that took place on June 26th. My next video will be about the June 27, 2019 Democratic primary debate among the presidential contenders, the one with Biden and Bernie Sanders. It, I imagine, will be quite interesting. So thank you so much for your time. Would love to know what you think, so feel free to tell me and leave comments, and I will chat with you again later. Bye.